Okay, so in the last video, we took a look at the first 4 paradigms and how they work in an individual context, right? So as you grew up, grew older, you started to unlock these different modes or ways of thinking, right? So now let's look at these same 4 paradigms, but let's look at them in a collective context or an organizational context. So how does an organization, a group of people, also phase through these same paradigms, okay? And ultimately where we want to get here is understanding the final Teal paradigm, okay? So let's take a look at this. Let's start with red in an organization. If you were to take any random collection of people, you gather up together a couple people, and you throw them out into the wilderness, the first kind of organization that can organize or exist, that's capable of organizing and tends to be the first kind of organization that does organize, is a red organization, right? So this is the impulsive paradigm. And so what you'll see happen is you take a group of people, put them out there in the wilderness, they're out there, need to figure out how to survive, and they're going to organize themselves by first going, okay, who here is the strongest, right? Who here has maybe the best survival skills, or who here has the gun, right? You're going to look around first and figure out who's sort of the strongest, and you're going to orient yourselves around that person, right? Just because of survival, because that person is going to probably give you the best chance of surviving. So let me see what I can offer to this person so that they can use the gun or their strength or whatever the resources that they have to keep me alive too, right? This is totally the strongman paradigm, right? So that's the first kind of organization that exists. And these organizations are still all over the place, right? A great metaphor for these kinds of organizations is that it's like a wolf pack, or it's kind of like the mafia, right? These are examples that came from Frederick Laloux's book, Reinventing Organizations, which I think are great. So working in an organization like this, right, who hasn't ever had that kind of boss, right? That kind of boss where it's like, oh man, you know, if I get on his bad side, he's got the power to eject me, you know? So this is something I think that we've probably all experienced to some degree or another. So a red organization is the first kind of organization that can exist. And it does actually allow for human beings to collaborate, to organize in some way, but I think we could all say that there's a better way, right? Okay, so then what comes next? Well, the problem that red organizations have is that they can't very easily manage complexity. So as you scale, it becomes harder and harder for the strongman to have influence over more and more people through simply fear. As there becomes more and more people there, you just eventually have to start to delegate. So the natural step that does happen next is some form of hierarchy. So the strong man eventually comes out and says, okay, here's my right-hand man, right? I need to have somebody that I trust, that I can rely on, and I'm going to sort of infuse some of my ability into him, right? And so to scale this, what happens is you start to come up with these symbols, right? And so eventually what there are is you see a crown for the person who's in charge, right? And then the people who are next in line, right, they get some sort of badge or maybe a ring on their finger or something that they wear on their arm. And this is to represent these people are my right-hand men, right? These people are essentially me if I'm not in your presence, right? And so this is what happens. To scale, you have to start to delegate. You create a form of hierarchy to handle the growing complexity. And over time, what happened in human history is that, well, you kind of start to not see the strong man anymore, and all that's really left is the crown, right? And the symbols that existed underneath it, right? And this is kind of where amber organizations grew from. The first organizations were just because somebody was maybe the strongest out of the group, and they were able to organize it and protect the people. But then over time, it turned into, well, they passed on that leadership to maybe their son or to somebody else. And how do you pass that leadership on? Well, it turns out it's most likely you give them some sort of symbol that represents the leadership, right? And so now we start to see authority and power represented in a symbol, right? And so this is largely where amber organizations come from. Okay, and so we see this with all kinds of amber organizations. A driving model that works well for these is that an amber organization is a lot like an army, right? You've got a hierarchy, you've got a structure, and you've got people put into positions and roles, and those roles represent the kind of authority or power or influence that that person has, right? So it's the symbols, okay? So this functions in both the structural sense of an amber organization. People are put into roles, And the person who holds that role has a responsibility or ownership or authority over other people. But this is also something that happens mentally in the way that we think about stuff. This is just like when we are individually developing, where we see things and do things without necessarily understanding why, but we're just following patterns. We see this in Amber organizations as well, right? So maybe it's that Thursday meeting that we always have every week, even if there's not necessarily something that we have to discuss. It's just something that we always do. So we continue to do it, right? Because that's what a productive company does, is we have meetings. And so if we're having meetings, we must be being productive, right? Or one of my favorites is this example that you see coming out of a lot of these startups, right? In Silicon Valley is this pressure that, like, hey, if we're really a startup and we're going to get investors, we got to like walk the walk and talk the talk of being a startup, which means we got to get startup t-shirts. And and once we get into our office space, we got to have a conference room that's, behind this secret door, because that's what all the startups do, right? You start to see all these patterns of like, we got to do that because that's what people are doing. And if we want to be like that, then we got to do the same thing. But it's all without understanding why. It's sort of the superficial level of understanding and more operating out of symbols, schemas, and tradition. Okay, so let's keep looking at how these organizations continue to develop throughout history. If you look back in the Age of Kings, right, you've got peasants who were born peasants. And if you were a peasant during this time period, you literally would think, this is what I am. There's no other way for me to be anything else. And that's how kings thought too. They thought, I was born a king. There's something about who I am and what I am that makes me a king, right? And so that's how people existed, right? They couldn't see outside of any way of being, right? And so that's kind of how Amber organizations sort of ruled the earth, right, during this time period. And this actually accomplished a lot. The Amber organizations of the world are the organizations that built the Great Pyramids, right? Built the Great Wall of China. This allowed for tremendous growth and opportunities for the human race because we were able to do much more than we could do before. Right? So just how a red organization allows for human beings to accomplish more together than they could without anybody at all, Amber organizations also allowed for more complexity and allowed for us to collaborate and accomplish more than we could if we were just operating in red organizations. And that's the general trend that we'll see through all of these, is each step allowed us to be able to accomplish more together.